Now the secular web with their theories, meaning guesses, says in Genesis chapter 2 verses 15 through 17 and chapter 3 verses 4 through 6, it is wrong to want to be able to tell good from evil. Wait, it almost sounds like something we did before. And you know what? It is something we did before. The only difference is they added the word want in it that's not even in the book, chapter, and verses that they give. And they want to say the Bible is inconsistent when they're being that way? No, I find the Bible to be consistent. Plus that last chapter and verses was Satan talking through the serpent, and they should make anybody think who they're really listening to. And that's why the serpent got punished for allowing Satan to use it. And if you don't believe me, believe what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10 verse 16. And don't forget Revelation chapter 12 verse 9 and chapter 20 verse 2. And also, if they wanted to know what good and evil was, the only thing they had to do is ask God. And then they want to compare it to the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 5 verses 13 and 14, saying it is childlike to be unable to tell good from evil. But the New Testament is talking about the babies. In verse 13, but 14 talks about whoever's old enough to come to know about both good and evil. Then these people don't want an argument saying that it isn't an argument, but they're contradicting themselves when they try to point out Bible contradictions. Then they say Genesis chapter 4 verses 4 and 5, which they should have said 2 through 5, and verse 7, to get the better understanding of the whole thing. And they mainly point out how God respected Abel's offerings and has no respect, I tell you, for Cain's. And this is why it is, because Cain didn't give his best. He only gave him one piece of fruit when Abel gave him the firstborn of his lambs. I mean, really, what sounds better to you? Just getting any old fruit or getting lambs? Then they would try to get you convinced by saying that the Bible is wrong, because they would say 2 Chronicles, which means a book of information, chapter 19 verse 7 and Acts chapter 10 verse 34 and Romans chapter 2 verse 11, that God, he treats everybody all alike, which is the wrong saying that they use that's not even in the Bible, and then tells the truth about God is no respecter of persons. But what they're missing are the fact that God don't respect somebody over another person. And the truth is, it's not like he didn't respect Cain, he only didn't respect his offering. And the reason why I know that he don't respect one over the other, just read Exodus chapter 2 verse 25, Leviticus chapter 26 verse 9, 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 28, 2 Kings chapter 13 verse 23, and Psalms chapter 138 verse 6. They mention that Genesis chapter 4 verse 9 said God asked Cain where his brother Abel is. Now this one, I like how they pointed out that God is everywhere, he sees everything, and nothing is hidden from his view. Proverbs chapter 15 verse 3, and Jeremiah verse 16 and 17, and chapter 23 verse 24, and Hebrews chapter 4 verse 13. But what God was doing was testing Cain, so he can confess what he did wrong, because Cain did it because he was scared that someone would have killed him. Verse 14, and these regular sitters didn't want you to keep reading on what you're supposed to do, because you learn in verse 10 and 11 that God actually did know about it. Howsoever, this next one is really big, but I would stick to the main points on this one, and only what they're really mainly saying is, how can a loving God be so mean? And by saying that, they're trying to prove that God is a hypocrite, and also that's why you can't trust the Bible. And then they will give you way too many book, chapter, and verses where you don't even want to bother with it like I have. The first one they would point out to you is, God is vengeful. But what they would not point out is, Psalms 111 verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Psalms 147 verse 11, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Romans chapter 12 verse 19 and Hebrews chapter 10 verse 30. Revenge is mine, said of the Lord. And isn't it good to know that God will get our revenge? Either this life or the afterlife or both. For anyone that did anything bad to any of us. I say it's good to know that God would get our revenge. And yes, there's a lot more scriptures about that. It's like our enemy neighbor. He's always bullying us, cussing us out, getting his buddies to gang up on us, trashing our yard, vandalizing us, doing all kinds of evil, and disturbing our peace for almost 12 years. So yes, I'm glad that God would avenge him for us. Howsoever, what they're missing out on is God is slow to anger. And that's where his patience, kindness, and self-control comes in. And that's the Spirit of God. Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 17. Psalms chapter 103 verse 8 and chapter 145 verse 8. Joel chapter 2 verse 13. Jonah chapter 4 verse 2. And Nahum chapter 1 verse 3. That means God is love because he's waiting for us to change from wrong to right. So at the end we have no excuse. But with all the sins happening around the whole world, that God is going to run out of patience.
His patience is running out.
So it's best to work our relationship with him now, and not in death where it's too late. But these people want you to believe there is no right and wrong, and there's no absolute. Is that an absolute? That sounds like they're being a hypocrite. Oh, I'm still recording.
If you think you're smarter than me, you think there's any argument you can make that I won't have an answer for?